you up. Get out.
Wow.
Now.
Wow.
Get out of the car.
For a failure to signal.
Bland was arrested in Prairie View after a
Sandra
traffic
Bland
stop.
had
This
fire in
traffic
her
stop
voice and light in
2015,
her
things got
stride.
sideways real
Born on February 7, 1987, in Naperville, Illinois, she grew up one of 5 sisters in a family that valued faith, resilience, and speaking truth even when it stung. She was sharp-tongued, when she needed to be, with a smile that could light a room and a laugh that came from her belly. She loved gospel music, Sunday dinners, and debating anything from politics to pop culture with friends and family. But what defined Sandra most was her conviction. She believed deeply in justice, in the power of Black voices to change systems built to silence them. She'd post videos online, Sandy Speaks, she called them, where she'd talk about police brutality, racial inequality, and the need for young people to stand up and fight for something bigger than themselves. In one of those videos, she said, "Being a Black person in America is very, very hard. Show me in history where all lives mattered." And that's why we're here today. By 2015, at age 28, Sandra's life was on the cusp of a new chapter. She'd recently accepted a job at her alma mater, Prairie View A&M University, in Texas. It was an opportunity to work closely with students, to mentor, to lead. She packed her car with everything she needed for a fresh start: clothes, essentials, hope, and left Illinois behind for Texas heat and open roads. It was a Friday morning, July 10, 2015. The sun beat down on Highway 290 as Sandra drove her silver Hyundai sedan near the small town of Prairie View. Music played low in the background. She had only been in Texas one day, getting ready for her new job. She'd been there less than 24 hours when State Trooper Brian Encinia's patrol car appeared behind her. The reason? Sandra had allegedly failed to signal a lane change. A minor traffic infraction that usually ended with a quick warning. But this was not going to be routine. Encinia pulled her over near FM 1098. His dash cam would later show the approach. His boots crunching gravel, his voice cool but sharp as he asked for her license and registration. Sandra complied. She was calm but visibly frustrated, saying she'd only changed lanes to let him pass. Their conversation was civil until he returned from his cruiser with a written warning. "Would you mind putting out your cigarette?" Encinia asked suddenly, his tone shifting. Sandra glanced up, taken aback. "Why do I have to put out my cigarette when I'm in my own car?" The dashcam microphone captured the tension crackling like static. Encinia's voice hardened. "Well, you can step on out now." Sandra refused, questioning why she had to exit for a lane signal violation. Encinia's voice rose. "Step out of the car," he barked, hand moving near his taser. Their voices collided. Sandra demanded to know her rights. Encinia snapped, "I'm giving you a lawful order." When she didn't move fast enough, he yanked open the car door. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Sandra shouted as Encinia threatened to light her up with his taser. Moments later, he had her pinned on the roadside grass, out of view of the dashcam. A bystander filmed as Sandra screamed in pain, saying he'd slammed her head to the ground. Her voice shook with fury and fear. "I can't wait," she cried out, "to take this to court." Sandra was shoved into the back of a police cruiser that day, wrists pinched tight in metal cuffs, her anger raw but contained. Onlookers stood at a distance, unsure what they were seeing but certain it was wrong. The trooper's report would later say she was combative. The dashcam footage told a different story, one of escalation, force, and a woman bewildered that a minor traffic stop had turned into a violent roadside arrest at 3:37 p.m. Sandra arrived at Waller County Jail. She was booked on charges of assaulting a public servant, a felony that carried serious weight in Texas. Mugshots were taken, her belongings sealed in a plastic bag. She was given an orange jumpsuit and placed in a cell barely big enough for her to pace. The charge meant she couldn't immediately post bond. She had to wait for Monday, when her family could arrange to wire money and secure her release. The jail itself was old, outdated. Security cameras flickered. Staffing was thin. Sandra's cell had a steel door, a hard bunk, and a small trash bag hanging beside a narrow bed frame. According to jail logs, she made multiple phone calls that weekend, to a friend, to her mother, telling them about the arrest, how badly her head hurt from being slammed to the ground, how determined she was to fight the charges. But beneath her fiery words, there was fear. She wasn't used to this place. She wasn't used to this system's cold grip. That on July 13, 2015, at approximately 9 a.m., jail officers claimed they checked on Sandra and found her unresponsive. A trash bag was tied to a partition in the cell, looped around her neck. The official report said she had hanged herself. She had been in custody for 3 days. The news shattered through social media. Family and friends refused to believe it. Sandra was outspoken, proud, excited about her new job. She had been making plans. She had told her mother over the phone she'd be out soon and ready to start fresh. Suicide didn't make sense. Not to them. Not to thousands who began posting with a single question: what happened to Sandra Bland? Within hours of the announcement, protests began forming outside Waller County Jail. Dozens of people stood in the sweltering July heat, holding signs with Sandra's face. They demanded answers, demanded transparency. Many shouted the same words. Her mother had spoken through tears. "My baby didn't kill herself." News vans crowded the streets. Reporters gathered in huddles. Microphones extended, cameras rolling. The jail released a brief statement. Sandra Bland had taken her own life. There were no signs of foul play. The case was under investigation. But the public wasn't buying it. On social media, videos from Sandra's arrest resurfaced. The dashcam footage, the bystanders' recording of her voice straining as she cried out on the roadside. They saw a woman with a plan, a purpose, and a will to fight in court. Not someone ready to surrender to despair. Questions piled up. Why had she been held for 3 days on a minor traffic violation? Why was there no immediate medical attention? After she claimed her head had been slammed into the ground, why had no one checked on her for long periods of time in that jail cell? How had she obtained the trash bag allegedly used to hang herself? Civil rights activists compared Sandra's case to a pattern: Black men and women dying under mysterious circumstances in police custody, their deaths labeled suicides or accidents. They pointed to racial profiling during the traffic stop, to the troopers' aggressive escalation, and to systemic negligence inside the jail. Hashtags flooded Twitter. Hashtag Sandra Bland. Hashtag say her name. Hashtag justice for Sandy. Vigils were held not only in Texas, but across the country: Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. Protesters carried candles, sang gospel hymns, and spoke Sandra's own words from her Sandy Speaks videos, where she had urged Black Americans to rise, unite, and demand dignity in the face of injustice. Her death was no longer just a local story. It was a movement. In the days that followed, Trooper Brian Encinia was placed on administrative leave. Calls for his firing and prosecution grew louder. Independent experts demanded an outside investigation into Waller County Jail's practices. Family attorneys pushed for the release of more footage and internal documents. Through it all, Sandra's mother, Geneva Reedveal, stood at podiums with unflinching resolve. "I'm the voice of Sandra now," she said, gripping a photograph of her daughter. "I'm going to find out what happened to her in that jail, and I won't stop until I do." As investigations deepen, the story shifts from a single cell in Waller County to the highest levels of federal scrutiny and a nationwide demand for change. The Texas Rangers and the FBI were brought in to investigate Sandra Bland's death. Public pressure left officials no choice. For weeks, forensic experts combed the small jail cell. They tested the trash bag used in the alleged hanging. They examined bruises, injuries, and autopsy results. The jail staff underwent intense questioning, their timelines and log entries scrutinized for inconsistencies. Authorities doubled down. The evidence pointed to suicide. The medical examiner's report stated there were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds suggesting homicide. Toxicology tests showed traces of marijuana in Sandra's system, which officials hinted could have contributed to mental distress. But for the Bland family and thousands rallying across the country, this explanation only fueled suspicion. Geneva Reedveal rejected the official story outright. "My daughter was not depressed," she told reporters. "She had a job waiting. She had plans." Sandra Bland would not have taken her own life. Civil rights leaders descended on Texas. Reverend Jesse Jackson, Alabama Sharpton, and activists from the Black Lives Matter network stood shoulder to shoulder with Sandra's family at vigils and marches. They compared her death to other cases of Black individuals who died in police custody: Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Kalief Browder. The refrain was the same: Systemic racism, neglect, and brutality had claimed another life, the center of outrage. Was Brian Encinia, the trooper who pulled Sandra over. The dashcam video became a viral symbol of racial bias in traffic stops. Experts in police conduct testified that Encinia had escalated the situation unnecessarily, turning a minor violation into an arrest. In January 2016, he was formally indicted for perjury, accused of lying in his report about why Sandra was ordered out of her car. Facing legal and public pressure, Encinia was fired from the Texas Department of Public Safety. Yet no one was charged for Sandra's death inside the jail. In 2016, Geneva Reedville filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Waller County and the Texas Department of Public Safety. The lawsuit alleged gross negligence, that jail staff failed to monitor Sandra properly, ignored signs of distress, and neglected basic safety protocols that could have saved her life. After months of legal battles, the case settled for $1.90 million. As part of the agreement, Waller County committed to reforms in jail procedures, including improved monitoring of inmates, better mental health training for staff, and stricter guidelines for handling detainees showing signs of emotional distress. But Geneva Reedville wasn't celebrating. "This isn't justice," she said. "This is accountability. Justice would mean Sandra walking out of that jail alive." Sandra's death also sparked legislative change. In 2017, Texas lawmakers passed the Sandra Bland Act, aimed at preventing future tragedies. The law required de-escalation training for law enforcement, improved mental health and substance abuse treatment for inmates, increased oversight of jail practices, mandatory reporting of jail deaths to independent agencies. Advocates welcomed the reforms, but noted glaring omissions. The law did not address racial profiling or traffic stop procedures, the very spark that ignited Sandra's fatal encounter. By then, Sandra's face had become iconic. Murals of her smiling portrait adorned city walls in Houston, Chicago, and Brooklyn. Poets wrote tributes. Musicians dedicated songs. Her Sandy Speaks videos, once quiet social media posts, played at protests and were quoted from podiums. By civil rights leaders. And across the country, women began chanting her name alongside others: Breonna Taylor, Atashiana Jefferson, Corin Gaines. It wasn't just a fight for Black lives anymore. It was a fight to make sure Black women's voices were heard in the national conversation about police violence. As Sandra Bland's name rises beyond a case file, becoming a rallying cry that forever reshapes the fight for justice in America. The summer of 2015 bled into autumn, but Sandra Bland's name refused to fade. Across the nation, her face appeared on handmade posters carried through streets during Black Lives Matter marches. College students painted murals on campus walls. Choirs sang hymns with her name woven into verses about freedom and resilience. It wasn't just the brutality of the traffic stop or the mystery of her death that gripped the country. It was who Sandra was. She had been outspoken, fearless, a young Black woman who used her voice to challenge injustice long before it claimed her life. People began rewatching her Sandy Speaks videos. In them, Sandra was alive again, her eyes burning with conviction, as she told young people not to be silent, not to let oppression crush their spirits. At the end of the day, Sandra said in one clip, "We are all human. We deserve to be respected as human beings. And until then, we're going to keep shouting." Those words became scripture for a new wave of activists. From this momentum emerged #SayHerName, a movement born from the recognition that Black women killed by police were too often erased from the headlines. While names like Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Freddie Gray dominated the news cycle, Sandra Bland's death revealed a deadly silence surrounding Black women's experiences with law enforcement. #SayHerName vigils appeared in dozens of cities. Women held photos of Sandra, chanting her name alongside those of others: Rekia Boyd, Natasha McKenna, and Yvette Smith. It wasn't just a hashtag. It was a reclamation of narrative, a declaration that Black women's lives, their struggles, and their stories mattered equally in the fight against systemic racism. Meanwhile, Geneva Reedville transformed grief into activism. She traveled the country, speaking at rallies, churches, and universities. She joined the Mothers of the Movement, a coalition of women whose children had died from police violence or gun violence. alongside Sabrina Fulton, mother of Trayvon Martin, and Gwen Carr, mother of Eric Garner. Geneva spoke about pain, perseverance, and the urgent need for reform. Sandra is not a martyr, Geneva often said. She is a messenger, and it's our job to carry that message until there's no more Sandras. Her words resonated globally. In London, Berlin, and Johannesburg, protesters carried banners with Sandra's face, making her story part of an international reckoning with racial injustice and police accountability that in the years following Sandra's death. Documentaries, investigative podcasts, and news specials examined the case in painstaking detail. Each new analysis unearthed more doubts about the official suicide ruling. Advocates pointed to glaring lapses in jail protocols, no documented checks during key time windows, faulty cameras that left gaps in footage, unsecured trash bags in cells despite prior incidents of self-harm, though no criminal charges were brought against jail staff. These findings added weight to public skepticism, ensuring Sandra Bland's death would never be seen as an open-and-shut case. Sandra's legacy also changed policing policies nationwide. Some jurisdictions introduced mandatory mental health screenings upon jail booking Sandra Bland cells, with improved visibility to prevent blind spots. Restrictions on pretrial detention for minor traffic violations. These reforms weren't enough to erase the pain, but they were proof that Sandra's story had forced a system to look in the mirror. Years later, on the anniversary of her death, thousands gathered at Prairie View A&M University for a candlelight vigil. They stood beneath a mural of Sandra, with her arm raised high, eyes fierce, lips curved into a knowing smile. Her mother stood at the podium, voice steady despite the ache that time could not dull. Sandra wanted change, she said, looking out over a sea of candles. She told you to keep shouting. So shout. Say her name. Say all their names, until the world cannot ignore us anymore. And the crowd answered, a single, thunderous voice echoing into the humid Texas night. Sandra Bland. The weeks after Sandra's death blurred into months, but every moment felt like a wound that refused to close. While vigils lit up across America, her mother Geneva Reedville navigated a maze of investigations, press conferences, and sleepless nights replaying her daughter's final phone calls. Every ring of the phone made her stomach twist. Every letter from state offices carried the possibility of answers, or more bureaucratic deflection. The Texas Rangers, alongside the FBI, compiled reports that ran hundreds of pages, each detail meticulously documented. Forensic experts examined the cell, the plastic trash bag tied to the partition, the bruising on Sandra's wrists and arms. The autopsy report repeated the official line, no evidence of foul play. But independent forensic pathologists hired by the family disagreed. They pointed to inconsistencies in how Sandra's body was found, questions about ligature marks, and the possibility of a staged scene. The lack of functioning cameras during critical hours only fueled suspicion. Inside the Waller County Jail, officers were questioned one by one. Their statements painted a picture of neglect, missed welfare checks, improperly logged rounds, and overlooked mental health screenings. One officer admitted under oath that trash bags had been left in cells for years without reconsideration, despite prior suicide attempts. Brian Encinia, meanwhile, faced his own legal battle. In January 2016, a grand jury indicted him for perjury, specifically for lying in his arrest affidavit about why he forcibly removed Sandra from her car. Emails and internal records revealed that the department had long been criticized for racial profiling and excessive force during traffic stops, yet officers like Encinia had faced little discipline. The perjury charge was a small, almost symbolic move, a misdemeanor with a maximum penalty of 1 year in jail. Still, it marked the first time any official faced legal consequences connected to Sandra Bland's case. The courtroom scenes were tense. Encinia's defense claimed that stress and chaos had clouded his memory. Prosecutors countered that his statement was deliberate, an attempt to justify an unnecessary escalation that directly led to Sandra's unlawful arrest and eventual death. Geneva sat in the gallery every day, flanked by activists and legal advocates. When the judge read the indictment, she whispered under her breath, "Finally." But in March 2017, prosecutors dropped the charge as part of a deal that permanently ended Encinia's law enforcement career. He would never wear a badge again. To Sandra's supporters, this felt hollow. No jail time, no conviction, just a quiet agreement that closed the book on criminal accountability. The civil wrongful death lawsuit, filed by Geneva Reed Veal against Waller County and the Texas Department of Public Safety, dragged on for months. Depositions revealed systemic failures, inadequate training for jail staff, understaffed facilities, and poor adherence to suicide prevention protocols. The Bland family's lawyers argued that had these standards been met, Sandra would have been alive. In September 2016, the lawsuit settled for $1.9 million. The agreement included promises of major reforms, improved mental health services in county jails, mandatory electronic monitoring to ensure welfare checks were completed, enhanced officer training to de-escalate encounters. Geneva accepted the settlement, not for closure, there was none, but to force a system to change in her daughter's name. While the legal battles unfolded, the streets roared. Black Lives Matter chapters organized marches through Houston, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. At one rally, thousands carried sunflowers, Sandra's favorite. Chants of "Sandy Still Speaks" echoed against courthouse walls. Activists read aloud transcripts from her Sandy Speaks videos, projecting them on screens in city centers. In Chicago, a group of young Black women organized a 30-day Speak Sandra's Truth campaign, posting one of her quotes daily on buses, billboards, and social media. In New York, artists painted a mural spanning an entire block, Sandra's face emerging from a storm of fiery colors, with her words, "I am here to change history," written beneath. The ripple effect reached legislatures. In 2017, Texas passed the Sandra Bland Act, hailed as a landmark reform. It required jail staff to undergo mental health crisis training, law enforcement to implement de-escalation tactics, independent investigations of jail deaths, yet activists noted painful omissions. Early drafts had included strict rules against racial profiling and limits on arrests for minor traffic violations. These were stripped away after political pushback, leaving the act incomplete. Internationally, Sandra Bland's name traveled beyond American borders. In London, thousands marched in solidarity, chanting her name alongside Eric Garner and Tamir Rice. In Berlin, activists projected her image onto the Brandenburg Gate. South African protesters carried signs that read, "From Cape Town to Texas, justice for Sandra Bland." Her death became a global symbol of how far-reaching racial injustice could stretch. Scholars cited her case in studies of police brutality and gendered racism. Organizations fighting for prison reform in Europe and Africa referenced Sandra Bland in their campaigns, tying systemic neglect of Black women worldwide to her story. Through it all, Geneva Reed Veal carried herself with a quiet strength. At speaking engagements, she told audiences about Sandra's laughter, her plans to mentor young students at Prairie View A&M, the joy she had felt just days before her arrest. She spoke about the cruel irony that Sandra had made videos urging people to know their rights, yet those rights hadn't protected her. One evening, at a memorial service in Chicago, Geneva read a letter Sandra had written in college. "Mom, one day, people are going to know my name for something good. I'm going to change things." Geneva's voice cracked. She looked out at the crowd, hundreds holding candles in the night, and said softly, she was right. They know her name. But the cost was too high. By 2020, during the nationwide protests after George Floyd's murder, Sandra Bland's face re-emerged on signs and murals. Protesters chanted her name, alongside Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and Elijah McClain. Hashtags like #SayHerName trended globally. A generation of young women entering activism cited Sandra as their reason for speaking out. Even as new tragedies unfolded, Sandra Bland's story remained uniquely haunting. She hadn't been shot on the street or killed in a chase. She had been pulled over for failing to signal a lane change, a moment that should have ended with a warning. Instead, it ended with a funeral. Years later, the Waller County Jail where Sandra spent her final hours underwent renovations. New paint covered old walls. Cells were updated, cameras installed. But officers who had worked that weekend still walked free, their names known to few beyond investigative reports. And Geneva still visits Sandra's grave, laying fresh flowers, sometimes sunflowers, sometimes roses. She kneels, tracing the letters of her daughter's name etched in stone. "I promised you," she whispers each time. I would never stop. Above her, the wind carries faint echoes of Sandra's own voice from those Sandy Speaks videos. Not just a call for justice, but a challenge that still hangs heavy over America. If you see injustice and you do nothing, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. Speak. Always speak. Into the final act of Sandra Bland's story, where her spirit outlives silence and her name becomes woven into every march for justice. Every whispered prayer for change. In the years following Sandra Bland's death, her story did not rest. It echoed through courtrooms, classrooms, and city streets, refusing to be forgotten. Every anniversary brought renewed vigils. Crowds gathered outside Waller County Jail, now updated with cameras and bright new paint, yet still carrying the weight of a tragedy that reforms alone could not erase. Geneva Reedville became a cornerstone of a national movement. She traveled from state to state, speaking on panels about policing, mental health, and racial profiling. She met with grieving mothers whose children had been lost to similar encounters. Some had no justice. Some had settlements like hers. But all shared the same hollow ache in their chests. At rallies, Geneva often began her speeches with Sandra's words. Sandy said, "It's time, y'all. It's time to wake up. I am her voice now, and I will not let you sleep through this." Her message drew standing ovations, but afterward, she'd retreat quietly, shoulders heavy. Justice was her mission. Grief was her shadow. The Sandra Bland Act, while imperfect, inspired new pushes for reform in other states. In California, activists lobbied for stricter limits on pretrial detentions for minor traffic violations. In Illinois, bills were introduced to improve jail monitoring systems. National conversations about mental health in custody and de-escalation tactics began citing Sandra's case as a turning point. Civil rights law courses across universities added Sandra Bland's name to syllabi next to landmark cases like Miranda versus Arizona and Terry versus Ohio. Professors dissected the traffic stop video frame by frame, teaching future lawyers how systemic racism operates not just in major crimes, but in the smallest encounters: a lane change, a cigarette, a refusal to bow under unnecessary authority. In 2020, as protests erupted after George Floyd's murder, Sandra's name roared back into the streets. Murals in Minneapolis showed her face beside his, painted with halos of yellow and blue. At night marches, candles were held high as chants broke the silence. Say her name. Sandra Bland. Younger activists, many just teenagers when she died, carried her story forward. They saw themselves in her defiance during the traffic stop, in her calm refusal to exit her own car without cause. They shared her Sandy Speaks videos on TikTok, millions of views bringing her voice to a new generation. In one viral clip, Sandra's words played over footage of protest lines and police barricades. All we want is to be treated equal. Is that too much to ask? It was as if she were speaking from beyond the grave, her message clearer than ever. Internationally, Sandra Bland became a symbol of intersectional justice. Activists in France carried banners with her name during marches against police brutality. In Paris, in Brazil, where Afro-Brazilian women face high rates of violence, Sandra's story was invoked during Senate debates on law enforcement reform. A South African university launched the Sandra Bland Fellowship, funding research into racialized policing. Documentaries and investigative specials kept her case alive. HBO's Say Her Name. The life and death of Sandra Bland drew millions of viewers worldwide. Podcasts examined every inconsistency in the official story, challenging narratives that had once seemed unmovable. The more the public learned, the more doubt spread about whether the truth had ever been fully told. Through all of this, Geneva kept Sandra's personal dreams alive. She funded scholarships at Prairie View A&M for young Black women interested in criminal justice and social activism. One recipient, a law student named Tiana, spoke at a memorial service, saying, "Sandra's death didn't silence her. It gave hundreds of us the reason to pick up where she left off. She wanted change. We are that change." Geneva embraced her with tears in her eyes, knowing Sandra's vision for mentoring young students had, in some way, come true. On the 5th anniversary of Sandra's death, hundreds gathered at Prairie View University's campus for a massive vigil. As dusk fell, attendees held sunflowers, Sandra's favorite, while speakers recounted her courage, her voice, and her legacy. A choir sang "This Little Light of Mine," their harmonies carrying across the campus fields. Geneva stood on stage, holding a framed photo of Sandra from her college graduation. When the music stopped, silence settled over the crowd. Geneva's voice cracked as she spoke. 5 years, and they thought we would forget. But every year, there are more of you, more voices, more hearts that know Sandra's story. My daughter's light hasn't dimmed. It's burning brighter. The crowd responded, not with cheers, but with a shared, reverent hush. Candles flickered. Children clutched sunflowers. And, as the vigil ended, hundreds walked silently to the edge of campus, placing flowers along a memorial wall etched with Sandra's name. Today, Sandra Bland's death remains a haunting question mark in American history. Official records say suicide. Millions believe otherwise. But beyond that contested truth lies something undeniable. Her voice, her fight, and her memory reshaped conversations about race, policing, and justice in ways no legislation alone ever could. Geneva Reedville still visits her daughter's grave often. She sits on the grass, running her fingers over the name carved into stone. She talks to Sandra as if she's just out of sight. "You did it, baby," she whispers. "They know your name. They will never stop saying it." And in the quiet hum of Texas wind, in every protest chant, in every reform bill debated, Sandra Bland's presence lingers, a light that refuses to die, a question America has yet to fully answer.